She paid for her daughter's wedding, every last detail. Pat Harlow, 70, arrived in her finest dress, expecting to be seated beside the daughter she had loved and sacrificed for. But the seat she paid for was occupied by someone else. Melissa, her only daughter, didn't even spare her a glance. By the end of the night, Pat would sever the bond that had defined her life, removing Melissa from her will. And when Melissa came for what she thought she deserved, Pat would let the documents speak for the mother she had once been. We're about to begin, but if you'd like, share where you're joining from. It reminds me this story doesn't echo into silence. It lands somewhere real. Drop it in the comments and don't forget to subscribe. Patricia Harlow adjusted the delicate clasp of her pearl necklace as she stepped out of the rideshare and onto the cobblestone drive of the Magnolia Ridge estate. Charleston's August air clung to her skin, thick with humidity and magnolia blossoms, but she stood straight in her pale lavender dress, the one she'd saved for something important. She smoothed the skirt, squared her shoulders, and let her eyes drift up to the grand colonial mansion where her only daughter's wedding was about to begin. Inside, classical music floated from hidden speakers, elegant string arrangements that swirled around the scent of fresh roses and imported lilies. Guests in silk and navy suits wandered from the cocktail terrace toward the ceremony lawn. Pat followed slowly, heels sinking slightly into the manicured grass. The aisle gleamed, white carpet, gold-trimmed chairs, soft petals lining the rows. Every detail had been perfect, just like the invoices she'd reviewed and paid over the past 9 months. She remembered writing the check for the aisle runner herself. It had arrived late, and she'd driven across town to pick it up in person so it would be there on time. She paused at the seating area, scanning the names printed in crisp calligraphy on each chair. Mr. and Mrs. Brooks family table, reserved, bridal party. Row after row of names, none of them hers. A teenage usher in a blazer, 2 sizes too big, approached. "Hi, can I help you find your seat?" "Yes, thank you," she replied with gentle grace. "I'm the mother of the bride." He flipped through the guest list on his clipboard. His brows furrowed. I'm not seeing that name. Are you sure you're not listed under another name?" "No," Pat said calmly. "Just Harlow, Patricia Harlow." The boy looked helpless. "I'm really sorry. I was told to only seat people with reservations. Maybe check with the coordinator?" But the coordinator was already rushing down the aisle, giving frantic hand signals to the string quartet. The ceremony was moments from starting. Pat looked back at the usher. He offered a shrug that might as well have been a shoulder turned cold. "I guess you can stand in the back," he said quietly, then turned away to greet a couple approaching from the cocktail area. She stood still, her gloved hands folded neatly in front of her. No one offered to help. No one noticed. From the altar, her daughter stood in lace and diamonds, radiant and flawless under the late afternoon sun. Melissa's smile stretched wide as she greeted the arriving guests with graceful nods, until her gaze flicked past the crowd and caught sight of her mother at the far edge of the lawn. Their eyes locked. Pat raised her hand in a tentative wave. Melissa looked away. Pat's hand hovered midair before falling back to her side. A woman seated in the front row leaned over to whisper something to a man beside her, glancing briefly in Pat's direction. Another guest followed their gaze and quickly turned away, adjusting her sunglasses as if embarrassed on Pat's behalf. The quartet shifted into the processional. Pat stepped back from the rows of seats and moved quietly to the very edge of the setup, beneath a swaying oak that filtered the golden sunlight. She stood alone, half in shadow, half in ceremony. The officiant began speaking. She could hear every word. She'd paid for the microphone system, after all. Her eyes didn't leave her daughter, not during the vows, not during the ring exchange, not even when Evan, the groom, glanced uncertainly toward her tree-shaded corner before quickly returning his attention to Melissa. And in that moment, Pat felt something inside her harden. Not break, harden. This was no misunderstanding, no logistical oversight. This was a choice. The guests rose for the recessional. There were cheers and clapping, camera shutters clicking, but Pat didn't move. She stood rooted in place as the crowd began drifting toward the reception tent. Her phone buzzed in her small clutch. A message from Sandra. "Where are you? I just parked." Pat stared at the screen, then typed slowly. "Somewhere they can't see me." She hit send, then slipped the phone back into her purse, turned her eyes to the crowd she'd paid for, and let the smile slip from her face. Pat moved through the side path of the estate, gravel crunching under her shoes, the laughter of guests floating just behind her like something from a life she'd stepped out of. She passed a catering tent, careful not to meet anyone's eyes, then slipped through a rear door of the house she'd toured with Melissa months ago when they'd been picking venues together, back when her opinion still held weight. The coolness of the air conditioning met her flushed skin as she entered the mansion's rear hall. Her fingers brushed the polished wood rail of the curved staircase, pausing briefly. She didn't know exactly where she was going, only that she couldn't stand there beneath that oak another second. She climbed the stairs slowly, deliberately, as if each step steadied her breath. A soft hum of music filtered in through distant vents, now muffled. The upper hallway was quiet, except for the faint tick of a grandfather clock and the distant rhythm of the quartet drifting upward from the lawn below. At the far end of the hall, a door stood slightly ajar. She nudged it open. It led to a small balcony, private, dressed in iron lattice and half-shaded by thick ivy. From here, Pat could see the ceremony lawn in full. The guests fanned out in perfect rows, sipping champagne now as the recessional faded. Melissa stood at the edge of the crowd, laughing as someone dabbed the corner of her eye with a napkin. Evan rested a hand on the small of her back, smiling nervously. Pat stepped forward, her hand lightly on the balcony rail. She watched in silence. No one looked up. Below her, the party buzzed to life. Clinking glasses, murmured congratulations, servers moving through with trays of crab cakes and artichoke bites she'd insisted on after the caterer pushed the cheaper options. She remembered each menu decision, every tasting, every payment, how Melissa hadn't once offered to split the cost. A vibration from her purse broke her trance. "Sandra." Pat pulled out the phone and read the message. "Where are you? I've been circling the lawn. I don't see you." Her thumbs hovered over the screen for a moment. Then she typed, "Somewhere they can't see me." Send. She stared at the message for a beat, then locked the phone and slid it back into her bag. Her fingers trembled slightly as she gripped the edge of the railing again. Her throat tightened. She blinked hard, refusing the tears at first, but they came anyway, unbidden, slipping down her cheeks with a quiet grace. Not the kind of tears that demanded pity. These were the kind that carried weight. Years of it. She reached up and gently wiped one away before it could fall from her chin. Down below, Melissa posed for a photo with Evan's family. The Brooks clan beamed, arms around one another, all smiles and champagne flutes. Melissa tilted her face slightly, making sure the sunlight hit just right. The photographer laughed at something she said. Pat watched it all like a ghost pressed against glass. And still, no one noticed. Not the planner, not the coordinator, not a single cousin. She wasn't even an afterthought. She'd been erased. Another laugh burst up from the patio. Melissa threw her head back in theatrical delight, then leaned in and kissed Evan on the cheek, her diamond catching the sun like a signal flare. Pat's jaw set. She didn't feel invisible anymore. She felt done pretending this had been some kind of oversight. Done hoping Melissa would turn around and remember who stood by her through every scraped knee, school play, college meltdown, and post-grad spiral. She remembered taking on a second tutoring job when Melissa needed help covering rent after her first big break fell through. No one saw that either. Pat breathed in sharply through her nose, chest lifting. Below her, Melissa turned, raising her champagne for a group toast. For a second, just a flicker, her eyes lifted toward the balcony. Pat stepped back into the shadows. Let her wonder. The silence in the car was loud enough to hum. Pat kept both hands on the wheel, her grip careful and steady, her eyes fixed on the two-lane road that cut through the marshland. The live oaks blurred past in her periphery, their moss-draped branches arching overhead like a cathedral. She didn't turn on the radio, didn't need the noise. The sun was beginning to dip as she pulled into her quiet neighborhood on the outskirts of Charleston, where the lawns were modest and the mailboxes leaned just slightly from years of coastal wind. Her driveway was empty except for Sandra's silver sedan parked tight beside the hedge. Pat turned off the engine, exhaled, and sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel. Then she stepped out. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of lemon oil and lavender, clean, lived in. Sandra stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing her hands and drying them on a checkered dish towel. When she turned, her face softened with concern. "You didn't answer my last text," she said gently. "I figured you'd gone home." Pat nodded once, set her clutch on the counter. "I did." Sandra studied her. "You okay?" "I'm not sure yet." She walked past her sister to the hallway closet, opened the bifold doors, and pulled down a slim plastic file box from the top shelf. It was clear, with a bright red label on the front in her tidy handwriting, "Wedding, paid in full." She carried it to the kitchen table and sat, the chair creaking slightly beneath her. Sandra followed, still drying her hands. Pat opened the box. Inside, every invoice had been 3-hole punched and filed neatly into a binder. Florals, catering, bar tab, band deposit, table rentals, custom signage, rehearsal dinner, alterations, makeup artist, calligraphy, dance floor, shuttle service. She flipped through each one with slow, deliberate fingers. "I paid for the champagne they toasted with," Pat said quietly. "Every bottle. You know how Melissa insisted on French? American sparkling makes people think you're cutting corners." Sandra didn't speak, only pulled out the nearest chair and sat down beside her. Pat continued. "Even the chair covers. She wanted a textured ivory linen instead of the standard white, said it elevated the look. I wired the payment for those 3 weeks ago." She tapped a page with her finger. 212 chairs. Sandra leaned in to look. "And not one of them for you." Pat's face didn't change. She turned to another page. "Cake was 7 tiers, red velvet, delivered from Savannah. I paid a rush fee because she changed the design last minute." But Pat wasn't done. She reached behind the binder and pulled out a single sheet, a breakdown of the total cost. At the bottom, $48,637.14, with every cent traced back to her checking account. "They didn't just forget me, Sandra. They planned a wedding and erased me from it." Melissa knew exactly what she was doing. She looked right at me today and turned her face like I was some stranger from the street. Sandra's lips pressed into a line, her hand closing into a fist against the table. "I swear, if I were 10 years younger..." Pat reached across the table, placed her fingers over her sister's hand. "Don't. It's not worth a scene." "But it's worth something," Sandra said fiercely. "You gave her everything, and she couldn't even give you a seat." Pat leaned back in her chair. The exhaustion was there in the slump of her shoulders, but so was something else, cool, deliberate, and sharp-edged. "They'll see what they threw away," she said. Sandra narrowed her eyes. "What do you mean?" Pat didn't answer. She simply closed the binder, slid it back into the box, and clicked the lid shut. Outside, the porch light flicked on with the fading sun. The next morning, the sun hung low and heavy behind a sheet of gray clouds, casting a dull light over Pat's kitchen. She stood by the window with a steaming mug of coffee, her eyes trained on the driveway as if expecting someone to pull up with an apology that would never come. Sandra leaned against the counter behind her, arms crossed, silent for once. Pat didn't look away from the glass. "I need someone who understands leverage." Sandra tilted her head. "So we're calling Richard?" Pat finally turned, her face unreadable. "Yes." Sandra nodded once, then walked over to the drawer by the phone, pulled out a slim black address book, and flipped to the C tab. She held it open for Pat. "Still listed under his office downtown," she said. "You want me to dial?" Pat took the receiver herself. "Number, I need to do this my way." She punched in the number slowly, deliberately, as if weighing each digit. The line rang twice before a receptionist picked up, bright and efficient. "Cole and Willoughby, attorneys at law. How may I direct your call?" "This is Patricia Harlow. I'd like to speak with Richard Cole, please. He handled my estate planning last year." There was a pause. Then, "One moment, Ms. Harlow. I'll see if he's available." Pat tapped her nail against the counter as she waited, short and controlled. Sandra busied herself with pouring more coffee but stayed close. The line clicked. "Pat?" Richard's voice was low, steady, familiar. "Hello, Richard." "It's been a while. What can I do for you?" There was no tremor in her voice. "I need to discuss a change in priorities." A beat of silence, then, "Understood. Would you prefer to come in?" "I'll bring documentation, this afternoon if possible." "Of course," he said. "See you at 2. Pat hung up. Downtown Charleston bustled with its usual afternoon rhythm, tourists snapping photos, locals in linen and seersucker ducking into shaded courtyards. But inside Richard Cole's office, time felt slower, cooler. The building was old brick and dark wood with high ceilings and a soft smell of paper and cedar. Pat sat across from him in a leather chair, the binder of invoices in her lap. Richard was dressed crisply in a navy suit and tortoiseshell glasses. His voice still carried the quiet calm of someone who preferred precision over emotion. "I want you to understand something before I show you this," Pat said as she laid the binder on his desk. "This isn't about vengeance." He didn't interrupt. "It's about clarity." She opened the binder, flipped to the summary sheet with the final cost. Richard adjusted his glasses, reading silently. Then, page by page, she laid it all out. Itemized proof that she had bankrolled a wedding she wasn't welcome at. He didn't react outwardly, but when he finally looked up, his eyes were sharp. "They excluded you deliberately?" "Yes." "And your daughter was fully aware that you paid for this?" "Every step," Pat said. "She signed off on every vendor. I have email trails." Richard leaned back, thoughtful. "From a legal standpoint, there's no cause for civil action here. These were gifts, not loans." "I'm not looking to sue my daughter," Pat replied, her voice cool. "I'm looking to decide who deserves what I have left." He nodded slowly. "Your estate plan from last year still names Melissa as your primary heir. You want to make changes?" "I do." Sandra, seated to the side, chimed in. "And I'll witness whatever's needed." Richard opened a drawer, pulled out a new form packet, and slid it toward Pat. "We can revise the will today, and just so you're aware, your assets are liquid enough that this won't require probate." Pat looked down at the form, then back up. A small smile crept across her face, more steel than warmth. "Then let's use it." Richard reached for a pen. As he began to write, Sandra caught Pat's eye. "This doesn't mean she's not still your daughter." Pat's voice was even. "It means she's not my mistake." The pen hovered in Pat's hand like a loaded weapon. Across the desk, Richard waited in patient silence, the new estate documents spread before her, every blank already filled, except for the signature line. Pat's gaze lingered on the thick paper. The font was elegant, almost gentle in its formality, but there was nothing soft about what it now represented. Melissa's name had been struck completely. In her place, Sandra Lee Harlow and the Charleston Future Teachers Scholarship Fund. No heirs by birth, only heirs by choice. She took a breath, deep and steady, then signed her name in 3 slow strokes. Richard flipped the pages with care, his notary seal clicking cleanly into place, stamping the new future into being. Pat felt something strange rise in her chest. Not regret, not sadness, but alignment. Like her bones had snapped back into place after being out of joint for too long. Sandra let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. "That's it?" she asked, glancing at Richard. He nodded. "Legally speaking, yes. The new will is binding. Filed here, time-stamped, witnessed. No contest unless she can prove coercion, and that's a losing battle." "She won't even know it exists," Pat said quietly. "Not until the day it matters." Richard glanced at her. "And even then, she won't be the first to hear it." Pat gave a faint smile. Sandra, emotional now, walked around the desk and wrapped her arms around Pat's shoulders. "You didn't have to do this for me," she whispered. "I didn't," Pat replied. "I did it for me." They stood like that for a moment, sisters stitched together not by obligation, but by earned loyalty. Pat stepped back, straightened her blazer, and lifted her chin slightly. Her shoulders, long stooped from carrying the weight of Melissa's entitlement, now squared naturally. There was a quiet, undeniable power in her stance. Richard watched her closely. "You look lighter." Pat turned to him. "I feel clear." He gathered the documents into a secure file folder, tucking it inside his briefcase. "One last thing before you go." She raised a brow. Your old will, the one Melissa thinks still exists. It's still on file if you want it. Pat looked puzzled. I don't need it. You might, Richard said carefully. Sometimes leaving bait in the trap tells you exactly who's looking to steal. Sandra blinked. You're suggesting she find it? I'm suggesting, Richard said evenly, that Melissa believes she still stands to inherit. That might be a more useful truth for now than the real one. The air in the room shifted. Pat walked to the window, arms crossed loosely as she gazed at the street below. A couple walked past the office hand in hand. A child ran ahead of them, chasing pigeons. Life moved, unaware of the sharp cut being made upstairs. She turned back to Richard. Let her cling to the illusion, Pat said softly. If she's going to show me who she really is, let her do it thinking she still has something to gain. Sandra whistled low. Now that's strategy. Pat smiled faintly, but there was no malice in it. Just clarity. Just closure waiting for its moment. Richard pushed the old will across the desk in a sealed envelope. For your safe, he said. She took it without hesitation. As she slid it into her handbag, the door to the office creaked open, an assistant stepping in. Sorry to interrupt, she said politely. Mr. Cole, there's a call holding. A Mr. Evan Brooks? Sandra and Pat froze. Richard glanced between them. I'll take it in private, he said quickly. You two can head out. Pat stood slowly, her hand brushing against the strap of her bag. Sandra looked at her. Want me to ask what he wants? Pat's voice was smooth. No. The house was still when Pat returned that evening, the only sound the soft mechanical hum of the AC kicking on as the sky dimmed behind the backyard pines. She locked the front door, dropped her purse on the entryway table, and walked straight to the hallway closet. No hesitation, no second thoughts, just the quiet determination of a woman putting a plan into motion. From the top shelf, she pulled down the small, fireproof safe she'd owned for years. It was heavy, black, and unremarkable, exactly the kind of thing no one would question, and no one would think to pry open unless they believed something inside was worth stealing. She carried it to her bedroom, set it on the low dresser, and spun the dial to the familiar code. Click. Inside, an old birth certificate, the deed to the house, her late husband's watch, and now, one more piece of bait. She slid the envelope labeled Last Will and Testament, 2023 into the back corner, angled just enough so that if anyone opened the safe snooping, it would catch their eye. Pat stared at it for a long moment before closing the lid. She locked it tight. Back in the kitchen, Sandra stood at the stove, stirring something in a pot that smelled vaguely of rosemary and white wine. She turned when she heard the safe click shut. Well? She asked, arching a brow. It's done, Pat said, slipping onto a bar stool at the counter. Sandra smirked. Let them cling to scraps. Pat let out the smallest breath of amusement. Scraps they believe are steak? Sandra passed her a glass of chilled white wine and leaned against the counter, watching her sister's face. You look calm, she said. Pat nodded slowly, eyes soft but clear. I am. And she meant it. Not the forced calm she'd put on for years to survive Melissa's entitlement or Evan's cold politeness, but something real, earned. There was no longer any hope of reconciliation, and strangely, that clarity felt like peace. The doorbell rang. Sandra's eyes widened. Don't tell me. No, Pat said quickly. Wrong energy. She rose and opened the front door to find Joanne Fletcher standing there, holding a slim envelope and wearing a faint, kind smile. Sorry to drop by unannounced, Joanne said, but I thought you might need this. Pat opened the envelope. Inside was a handwritten voucher. Weekend getaway, 2 nights on the house. Use anytime, no rules, just rest. Joanne's voice was low. You looked like someone who needed a place where no one's expecting anything from her. Pat blinked back a swell of emotion she hadn't expected. Thank you, she said simply. Joanne gave her a nod, then added, You were never invisible, just around the wrong people. Pat watched her walk back to her car, the taillights glowing briefly before disappearing down the street. Inside, Sandra read the note over Pat's shoulder. You should go, she said. Seriously, get out of this town for a couple days. Clear your head. I'm not running, Pat said. No one said you were, Sandra replied. But rest isn't weakness, Pat. You've done the hard thing. Maybe let yourself breathe now. That night, after dinner, and a quiet episode of a British mystery they both half-watched, Pat stood at the kitchen counter, phone in hand. The voucher sat next to her, catching the underlight from the cabinets. She pulled up the inn's website, selected check-in, Friday, check-out Sunday, and tapped reserve. Her name auto-filled. She hesitated for just a second, then deleted it. Typed in P. Harlow. Just enough anonymity to be left alone, just enough truth to remember who she was. The room at the boutique inn smelled of chamomile, linen, and something faintly floral Pat couldn't name, but instantly loved. It wasn't luxury in the glossy magazine way, but it was thoughtful. The sheets were crisp, the window cracked just enough to let in the salt-tinged Charleston air, and on the small side table sat a tea tray already steeping. Pat sat curled into a cushioned armchair by the open window, slippers on her feet and a book in her lap she hadn't bothered to open. The sounds from downstairs, clinking cups, soft conversation, the occasional laugh, drifted up like echoes from a different kind of life. Her phone buzzed where she'd left it across the room. She didn't move. Instead, she picked up her teacup, warm and fragrant in her hand, and took a slow sip. Joanne knocked once on the open doorframe and peeked in. Too quiet up here? Perfectly quiet, Pat said, managing a soft smile. Joanne walked in, wiping her hands on a towel. Some guests are out on the back terrace. You're welcome to join, but no pressure. I might stay here a while longer. Joanne nodded, but before leaving she paused. You know, she said, there's a difference between being alone and choosing solitude. You've earned the right to choose. Pat tilted her head. And if the choice is to be left alone completely for a bit? Joanne grinned. Then I'll make sure no one knocks except me. Pat watched her disappear down the hall and felt something lift in her chest. It wasn't freedom exactly, but it was its cousin. The phone buzzed again. She finally stood and walked over to check it. Melissa. The text read, "We need to talk. That stunt at the wedding was hurtful. Call me." No apology, no question. Just accusation. Pat stared at it, let her thumb hover over the screen, then pressed the power button, silencing it. She wouldn't give it oxygen. Not here, not now. Later that night, as the air cooled and the patio lights strung between the trees began to glow like fireflies, Sandra arrived in her usual casual chaos, wind-blown hair, a tote bag slung over one shoulder, and a bottle of red wine sticking out of the top like a flag of good intentions. "I brought the good kind," she said, holding it up. Joanne handed her 2 glasses and left them alone on the back patio beneath a wide umbrella. The cicadas had finally quieted. Everything felt hushed and safe. Pat poured slowly. "I didn't know you were coming." Sandra shrugged. "Didn't want you turning into some brooding recluse by Sunday." Pat smiled as she passed her a glass. "I think I'm doing the opposite of brooding." They clinked. For the first time in days, maybe weeks, they laughed. Real laughter. Deep and loose. Not at Melissa's expense, not at anyone's. Just 2 sisters remembering who they were when the noise stopped. At one point, Sandra reached across the table and tapped Pat's hand. "You know, you're allowed to feel joy." "I'm getting there," Pat said, not entirely joking. She leaned back in her chair, wine glass in hand, head tilted toward the sky. A breeze swept in from the coast and brushed across her arms. She closed her eyes and let it. By the time Pat returned to her room, the wine had made her limbs feel pleasantly warm. She washed her face, changed into a fresh nightgown, and finally, curiously, powered her phone back on. One voicemail, Melissa. She pressed play and held it to her ear. The tone was tight, controlled, but just under the surface, resentment. "Hi, Mom. Not sure what's going on with you, but ignoring me isn't okay. You embarrassed me. You could have at least told me you weren't feeling well or whatever it is you're doing. I really don't understand this sudden change in behavior, but I deserve some kind of explanation. Call me." The message ended. No warmth, no concern. Just bruised ego and subtle blame. Pat set the phone down on the nightstand and climbed into bed. She didn't cry. She didn't clench her jaw. She just turned out the light and lay still, hands folded across her stomach like someone who'd already buried something. Back home on Monday morning, the quiet had a different tone than before. It wasn't the stillness of being left behind, it was the stillness of preparation. Pat sat at the kitchen table, laptop open, file folders spread out in neat columns. Receipts, emailed confirmations, scanned checks, and payment stubs filled the screen in overlapping tabs. She was back in teacher mode, organized, unbothered, methodical. Sandra walked in barefoot, hair wet from a shower, and glanced at the table. "Is this war prep or therapy?" "Both," Pat said without looking up. "I'm consolidating every payment I made into one formal record." She tapped her keyboard. Catering, venue, makeup, invitations, even the dance floor upgrade she insisted on, for the photo ops. Sandra opened the fridge and pulled out orange juice. "You're not thinking of going public with all this, are you?" "No," Pat said calmly. "But I'm making sure I have everything documented, just in case." Sandra arched a brow. "You think she'll try something?" "I think people like Melissa don't like when their image gets challenged. If I'm already the villain in her story, I might as well be a prepared one." Later that afternoon, Pat slid into the familiar leather chair across from Richard's desk. He adjusted his glasses and took the USB she handed him. "All verified?" "Double-checked, labeled, itemized, date-stamped, with PDFs of every signed agreement." He nodded, slotting it into his encrypted client drive. "It'll be in your file. If she or her husband ever try to paint a different picture, well, this one's in full color." Pat gave a small nod, her expression unreadable. Richard added gently, "You're doing the quiet kind of smart, the kind that holds up in court." "I don't want court," Pat said, "but I'm no longer afraid of it either." That evening, while Sandra made dinner, she called from the kitchen, "You seen Melissa's Instagram lately?" Pat paused in the hallway. "No." "She's been posting nonstop, full wedding recap, hashtags, professional shots, that shot of her fake crying during the vows, front and center." Pat walked over slowly and accepted the phone from her sister. Sandra's screen glowed with a perfectly edited carousel, Melissa beaming under the floral arch, Evan lifting her hand for a kiss, champagne flutes lined up with gold-trimmed napkins. Caption, "Blessed beyond words, family-funded fairy tale. Brooks wedding, 2025. Grateful, elevated elegance." Pat read it all twice. Sandra muttered, "Family-funded? She mean you? Or did Evan's people buy the napkins and forget to mention it?" Pat didn't answer. She took out her own phone, opened the post, and quietly started taking screenshots. Every caption, every tagged vendor, even the hashtag string. Sandra watched, expression tight. "You think she's laying groundwork?" "I think she's building a public image," Pat said, tapping her screen. "And forgetting that public images are fragile." The next morning, Pat walked into the boutique inn, holding a small bag of pastries. Joanne looked up from behind the front desk and smiled warmly. "You're back," she said. "I needed to say thank you," Pat replied. "The weekend helped more than I expected." Joanne accepted the bag and peeked inside. "Ooh, almond croissants. You really didn't have to." "I know," Pat said, "but I wanted to." Joanne gestured toward the side parlor. "Come sit for a minute." Pat followed her in. The morning sun filtered softly through the gauze curtains, casting warm patches of light on the hardwood floor. As they sat, Joanne studied her for a moment. "You look steadier, like something got settled." "Something did," Pat said, sipping her tea. Joanne leaned forward, elbows on knees. "You didn't just get through the storm, Pat. You built a levee while it rained." Pat smiled quietly. Joanne added, "Whatever you're doing, keep going. You're playing the long game and it suits you." The courthouse wasn't dramatic. It was beige brick and brass fixtures, the kind of building that passed for formal in Charleston without trying too hard. Inside, it smelled faintly of lemon cleaner and old case files. Pat stood by the security desk, handbag in hand, waiting for Richard to clear the scanner. Sandra was beside her, thumbing through an old Reader's Digest she'd picked up from the waiting area like she hadn't a care in the world. "You ever think it'd come to this?" Sandra asked, not looking up. "I used to think I'd leave her everything," Pat replied softly. "That was the plan." "And now?" "Now," Pat said. "I'm leaving what matters to people who've proven they value it." Richard returned, motioned them forward with a nod. "They're ready for us upstairs." Inside the clerk's office, Pat signed her name 3 times, once on the master file, once on the court-sealed envelope, and once on the final notarized certification. Her hand didn't tremble. Her signature was crisp, clean. Sandra leaned against the wall with her arms crossed, watching closely. Richard handed the sealed envelope to the clerk, who filed it without fanfare. "That's it," Richard said. "It's official. The revised will is now your legal and public estate document. The rest, digital copies, encrypted backups, are already secured." Pat exhaled slowly. Richard gave her a warm, careful look. "You did this with clarity. Most people wait until it's too late or let guilt do the writing. You didn't." "I couldn't afford to," Pat said. "Not anymore." Back in the car, Sandra pulled out her sunglasses and looked over at Pat. "You left her out completely?" "Yes." "No clause for reconciliation?" "No clause for fantasy." Sandra stared at her for a long beat. "You added more to the scholarship, didn't you?" Pat smiled faintly. 50,000 more. It'll fund a teacher's first classroom setup every year for the next decade." Sandra's voice caught. "That's beautiful." "She hated how much time I gave my students," Pat said, eyes on the road ahead. "Let her live in a world built by the people she dismissed." By the time they got back to Pat's house, the sun was climbing high and the coastal heat was starting to creep into the windows. Pat opened the screen door, dropped her purse on the table, and headed for the fridge. Sandra checked her phone and froze. "What is it?" Pat asked, pouring herself a glass of water. Sandra held up her screen like it burned to touch it. A text from her friend Meredith, who taught Pilates part-time at a country club off-Broad. Did Melissa really say she's already got your mom's estate? Said it at brunch like it was locked in. Everyone at the table just blinked. Thought you should know." Pat lowered the glass slowly. Sandra was already pacing. "She said it like it was hers, like it's guaranteed. She's bragging to women with monogrammed tennis rackets." "She must have seen the old will," Pat said quietly. "Or assumed nothing changed." "She's not just assuming," Sandra said. "She's already laying claim." Pat walked to the hallway and opened the closet. She pulled the safe down again, spun the dial, and opened it without hesitation. The old will was right where she'd left it, untouched, still sealed. Her eyes narrowed slightly. "She didn't see it," Pat said. "She doesn't need to." Sandra blinked. "What?" "She believes she's owed something," Pat said. "Belief is louder than proof." Sandra stared. "She's going to get bolder." "I know." The morning air had turned slightly crisp, a quiet reminder that Charleston's long summer was finally beginning to wane. Pat stood at her kitchen window, watching the branches of the dogwood tree shift lazily in the breeze. A few golden leaves clung stubbornly, not yet ready to let go. She sipped her coffee slowly, savoring the warmth, the silence, and the rare sense of stillness that had begun to take root deep inside her. In the distance, a lawnmower buzzed somewhere down the block. The noise wasn't irritating, it was grounding. For once, she felt entirely present in her own skin. The front door creaked open without ceremony. Sandra's voice floated in from the hallway, trailing the scent of bakery paper and fresh gossip. "Pat, you need to hear this one." Pat didn't turn from the window. "Let me guess. Melissa opened her mouth in a public place again." Sandra entered the kitchen holding a white pastry box in one hand and her phone in the other. "You're not far off," she said, setting the box down on the table and flipping her phone screen toward Pat. "Meredith from the country club just sent me this." Pat finally turned, took the phone, and scanned the message. She was at brunch at the Cypress Room, told a whole table that she's already designing the house, said it like it was a done deal, picking out paint colors, talking about where the bar cart should go. People were stunned. Pat raised her eyebrows slightly and handed the phone back, not in anger, but with the cool detachment of someone who had expected worse. Sandra scoffed. "It's like she's trying to win Delusion of the Year." Pat reached for the box and opened it, revealing a still warm cinnamon twist. She broke off a piece and sat down at the table without speaking for a moment. Then, with complete calm, she said, "If Melissa wants to imagine her future in this house, she's welcome to do it. But she might want to find a more honest place to start than brunch with strangers. Sandra laughed under her breath. You're really not mad? Pat shook her head gently. I'm entertained. Honestly, I don't think she understands that the only thing more dangerous than entitlement is entitlement without a safety net. Outside, a neighbor walked past the front window with their golden retriever. The woman gave a quick wave when she noticed Pat in the kitchen, but it lingered a second too long. Not rude, just cautious. Pat raised a hand in return. Sandra caught the look. That's the third one this week. People are talking. Pat didn't seem fazed. Then let them. Later that day, Pat stopped by the inn just as the afternoon light began to pour through the windows in soft golden streaks. Joanne greeted her with a nod from behind the front desk and gestured toward the small parlor near the garden. You've got good timing, Joanne said. Fresh pot just brewed. You want your usual? Yes, please, Pat replied, removing her scarf and draping it over the back of one of the high-backed chairs. I figured I'd borrow the quiet for an hour or two. Joanne returned a few minutes later with 2 cups, one for herself, and sat opposite Pat in the glow of the late-day sun. I heard a little noise about your daughter's brunch declaration, Joanne said without ceremony. That girl could start a fire in the middle of a fountain. Pat's smile was small but genuine. She's certainly not subtle. Joanne took a sip and studied Pat's face. But you're not reacting. That's what's unsettling her, you know. I know, Pat said, and I plan to keep it that way. That evening, back at home, Sandra sat at the kitchen counter flipping through a coupon booklet when her phone buzzed with a new message. She glanced at it and sighed. Melissa, she muttered, then passed the phone to Pat. The text read, I hope you're not mad. I just think we need to clear the air. Let's not let this become a whole thing. Pat read it twice, then quietly placed the phone face down on the table without responding. Sandra narrowed her eyes. You're not going to answer that either? I already have, Pat said. She just hasn't heard it yet. The kitchen table was cleared of everything except a legal pad, a pen, and the weight of what needed to be said. The morning was gray, the kind of overcast that dulled the edges of the world just enough to make it feel still. Outside, birds chirped in short bursts, but inside the house it was silent, purposefully so. Pat sat with her robe pulled tight at the collar and a mug of black coffee that had long since gone cold. Her fingers hovered over the page. She wasn't one to labor over words, but today wasn't about eloquence. It was about truth. She began at the top of the page in her neat, teacherly script, to whom it may concern. Then she paused. That wasn't right. She drew a line through it and started again. To my daughter, Melissa. The pen moved slowly at first, as if testing the waters, then found its rhythm. There was no anger in the lines she wrote, no venom. What spilled onto the page was something harder to write, and perhaps harder to read, clarity without apology. She told the truth. She described the kind of child Melissa had been, bright, determined, full of big dreams and sharp elbows. She recalled the little girl who'd once clung to her leg at kindergarten drop-off, and later the teenager who'd asked for space but never returned the grace when it was needed in reverse. She detailed the sacrifices, financial and emotional, and the ways she had offered help without strings, only to find herself bound by invisible ones Melissa had pulled tighter over the years. Pat acknowledged her role too, noting the moments when she had excused entitlement, enabled poor decisions, and tried to love harder instead of setting limits. And then, with steady hand, she explained why Melissa had been excluded from her estate, not as punishment, but as a decision grounded in character. Inheritance is not a birthright, she wrote. It is a reflection of trust, gratitude, and values shared. In the end, I could not leave my life's work, my savings, my home, my peace, in the hands of someone who could not see me on the most important day of her life. She didn't cry. She didn't shake. What surprised her most was how freeing it felt to simply write the truth, plainly and without decoration. When she finished the letter, she added a postscript. P.S. I hope one day you will come to understand this not as a betrayal, but as a boundary I should have drawn much sooner. She folded the page carefully, slid it into a plain ivory envelope, and wrote Melissa across the front in the same cursive she used to label her daughter's lunchbox in second grade. That afternoon, Pat sat once again across from Richard Cole in his office. His desk was, as always, immaculate. Framed degrees, a heavy brass pen holder, and a discreet black scanner positioned for quiet efficiency. Richard read the letter silently, eyes scanning with measured pace, and then gave a slow nod. "It's clear," he said, tapping the edge of the envelope. "It's not cruel, just honest. And legally speaking, it's useful. It reinforces intent. Would you like me to notarize it?" "Yes," Pat said, "and I want a certified copy in the file with the updated will." He stood, took the envelope to a small counter near the window, and carefully stamped and sealed the letter into formal documentation. Pat watched with the same stillness she'd held all morning, not numb, not cold, just resolved. Once he handed it back, she tucked it into her handbag without fanfare. "Anything else you want to include?" Richard asked. "Yes," Pat said, reaching into her purse. She pulled out a second envelope. This one was labeled in softer ink, for the Charleston Future Teachers Fund. Inside, she had written a note of gratitude, addressed not to an institution, but to the teachers yet to come. She spoke of her belief in the power of early classrooms, of first-generation college students, of dignity built from pencils, patience, and possibility. Richard gave her a long, quiet look. "That's beautiful." "It's the only thank you I ever wanted," Pat replied. That evening, back at home, she opened the hallway closet one final time, pulled the secure file from the top shelf, and placed the notarized letter inside. She didn't lock it away in the safe this time. This wasn't bait, this was record. When she closed the file, she paused in the hallway. Sandra stood at the end of it, holding 2 cups of tea, one eyebrow raised. "You done writing thunder?" Pat took the tea, smiled softly, and said, "No thunder, just lightning, quiet and direct." The knock on the front door wasn't hesitant or polite. It was loud, repetitive, sharp enough to cut through the stillness of the late afternoon. Pat didn't flinch. She sat at the kitchen table, folding a dish towel in her lap with the same care she used to fold paper napkins for school events long ago. Across from her, Sandra slowly stirred honey into her tea, unbothered. There was another knock, then a voice, tight, shrill, unmistakable. "Mom, open the door. We need to talk, right now." Pat looked up at Sandra. "She's early," she said softly. Sandra raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "She's loud." Out on the porch, Melissa's voice sharpened. "I know you're home, I saw your car, and Sandra's. You're really not going to open the door, seriously?" Pat stood, walked to the counter, and refilled her mug from the kettle that had been keeping warm on the stove. The mug read, "Charleston teachers make history in faded blue print." She returned to her seat without glancing toward the door. Another series of knocks followed, faster now, laced with frustration. "Unbelievable," Melissa called. "You're really going to ignore your own daughter like this? After everything? After I invited you?" Her voice broke off mid-sentence, as if the memory of the wedding gave her just enough pause to realize how it sounded out loud. Then, quieter, but still pointed, she added, "I know you've been talking to people. I know things are shifting." Inside, Pat took a long sip of her tea. Sandra leaned back in her chair and crossed her legs. "This your version of noise canceling?" she whispered. Pat smiled faintly. "It's decency in liquid form." On the porch, Melissa's frustration turned brittle. She rattled the door handle once, more in symbolism than in true hope, and let out a scoffing laugh. "You're seriously hiding inside like some kind of victim? What happened to you?" There was a long pause. Then came the sound of heels on the front steps, quick, clipped, and retreating. A car door slammed, then silence. Pat didn't speak for a moment. She simply sat back in her chair and looked out the window, watching as a squirrel darted along the fence line, startled but unfazed. Sandra finally stood and walked over to the door. She peeked through the curtain, confirming what they both already knew. "She's gone," she said. Pat didn't nod. She just let out a breath that had been waiting patiently in her chest. Sandra turned back to face her. "That was easier than I thought." "Not easier," Pat said. "Just inevitable." She reached for the sugar jar and tapped out a small spoonful into her cup. The clink of metal on ceramic echoed briefly in the room before dissolving into quiet. "I thought she'd try harder," Sandra admitted, "that she'd wear you down." "She doesn't want reconciliation," Pat said gently. "She wants reassurance, and she knows she's run out of it." They sat in companionable quiet for a few minutes, the tension in the room finally beginning to dissolve. The light through the window was turning golden, casting long shapes across the floor. Just as Pat reached to collect the cups, her phone buzzed on the table. Unknown caller. She stared at it for a moment, then answered. "Hello? Patricia?" came the familiar voice. "It's Joanne. Sorry to call, but I saw someone sitting in their car outside the inn for a while earlier. Blonde, looked upset. Just figured you'd want to know." Pat closed her eyes for a beat. "You're right. I do." "She didn't come in," Joanne added, "just sat there, then drove off, fast." "Thank you," Pat said, "for letting me know." There was a pause on the line, and then Joanne's voice lowered just slightly. "You okay?" Pat looked across the table at Sandra, who was watching her with quiet concern. She let herself be silent for another breath, then said, "Better than I've been in years?" The courthouse elevator moved slowly, humming beneath Pat's shoes as she and Sandra ascended to the third floor. Neither of them spoke. There was no tension between them, only the reverent quiet of a day with weight, like a last page you turn knowing it won't be followed by another chapter. When the doors opened, Richard was already waiting in the hallway with a small folder tucked under his arm. He looked crisp as ever, though his tie had been loosened just slightly, a rare concession to the South Carolina heat. "This way," he said, motioning them toward a smaller clerk's chamber off the main corridor. "They're ready for you." Inside, the walls were paneled in honey-stained wood, the light overhead soft and flattering in a way only old buildings ever manage. There was no judge, no ceremony, just a notary clerk, 2 chairs, and a signature line on the final sealed copy of Pat's estate plan. Richard laid the folder open across the table. "All the language has been updated," he said. "The residual clause is gone, so nothing defaults. Melissa's name no longer appears anywhere, in any category. No contingency, no survivorship clause, nothing left to interpretation." Pat nodded, took the pen from his hand, and signed her name one final time, each stroke calm, even, resolute. Richard slid the pages across to the clerk, who stamped them into permanence. Then he turned back to Pat with the final item in his file. "One last amendment," he said. "You'd asked to include the liquid asset bundle into the scholarship?" "Yes," Pat said. "Add the CD, the investment dividends, and the last IRA drawdown. It should be enough to sustain the fund for at least 20 years. Sandra let out a soft exhale behind her. Richard added the clause with a final flick of his pen, then sealed the packet, pressing the envelope closed with the weight of finality. "It's done," he said. Pat leaned back in her chair. For the first time in what felt like years, her body didn't feel like it was holding anything in. No tension between her shoulders, no dull ache in her chest, no weight behind her eyes. It wasn't relief, it wasn't vengeance, it was peace. As they walked back into the bright August sunlight, Sandra looped her arm through Pat's and said, "You've rewritten the ending, you know." Pat smiled, eyes shaded behind her sunglasses. "Number I just made sure the right person gets to write the next chapter." They drove home in quiet comfort. The windows were cracked, the breeze was warm but not oppressive. When they pulled into the driveway, a small envelope was wedged beneath the screen door. Sandra bent down to pick it up. "No return address," she said. Pat didn't even look. "Leave it." Inside, Sandra brewed a fresh pot of green tea while Pat opened the hallway closet for the last time. The estate documents, sealed, notarized, and legally impenetrable, were placed carefully into the secure file, now resting like a compass pointing toward the future she'd chosen. She closed the folder and let her palm rest flat against its surface for a moment longer than necessary. "You've done it," Sandra said behind her. "You walked away without flinching." "I didn't walk away," Pat said. "I stayed rooted while everyone else drifted." Sandra stepped forward and wrapped her arms around her sister in a quiet, wordless hug. When she pulled back, her eyes were full but steady. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Pat blinked slowly. I'm finally proud of me, too. Later that evening, just as twilight brushed the sky with lavender and gold, Pat received a call from Joanne. "Are you free this Friday?" Joanne asked, casual but with a telltale lilt in her voice. "I could be," Pat replied. "Why?" "I'm hosting a dinner at the inn. Small, just a few friends, local teachers, scholarship coordinators. Some folks who've seen you and wanted to say thank you." Pat paused. "Say thank you? For what?" "For being the kind of woman who shows up when it's hardest, for building something that will outlive you, for reminding us how to stand still without becoming stuck." Pat swallowed once before answering. "I'd be honored." Joanne's voice softened. "Dress nice, okay? Nothing too formal. But it's your night." The inn glowed like a memory someone wanted to keep. Candlelight flickered along the windowsills, and soft jazz floated through the open doors, mingling with the scent of rosemary, baked peaches, and something rich and savory wafting from the kitchen. A few strings of lights crisscrossed the garden, casting golden halos across the worn brick patio, where clusters of people stood in easy conversation. Pat stood just inside the entrance, one hand resting lightly on the back of a wooden chair. She wore a navy-wrap dress, understated pearls, and the kind of calm grace that comes from surviving something quietly and completely. Her hair was pinned simply, the way she'd worn it most of her life, not for attention, but for ease. The moment she stepped into the room, there was a pause, not dramatic, just long enough for those present to turn, register her presence, and then break into warm, sustained applause. Joanne stepped forward, her linen dress swinging softly at her sides, and gestured her toward a seat near the head of the long farmhouse table. "This night," Joanne said, "is for you." Pat blinked once, caught off guard, not by the kindness, but by the unfamiliar feeling of being seen in a way that wasn't about duty or obligation. She made her way to the seat slowly, touching shoulders here and there, clasping familiar hands. There were faces she recognized from years ago, retired teachers, former students now grown, a few city volunteers she'd worked alongside, a principal who once cried when Pat chose to stay after budget cuts. At the far end of the table, Sandra stood, glass in hand, already grinning like she'd been waiting months for this moment. "I don't usually do speeches," Sandra began, "mostly because I tend to say things I regret. But tonight I'm going to say exactly what I mean." She held her glass a little higher. "To my sister, Pat, the woman who taught half this town to read and the other half how to hold their heads high, the woman who paid for a wedding she wasn't welcome at, smiled through it, and still came home and made tea, the woman who rebuilt her boundaries with dignity, not bitterness." A murmur of approval swept the table. A few glasses clinked prematurely. Sandra's voice steadied. "We live in a world where quiet women get overlooked, where loyalty gets mistaken for weakness. But not tonight. Tonight, we celebrate someone who showed us that choosing yourself doesn't mean choosing against others. It just means knowing your worth." She looked directly at Pat, her voice soft now. "You've been overlooked long enough. We see you, and we are so, so proud of you." She raised her glass fully. "To Pat." "To Pat." The room echoed. Pat's laugh broke free then, deep, warm, surprised by its own volume. She covered her mouth for a moment, blinking quickly, then stood slowly, accepting the toast with a slight bow of her head. "I don't know what to say," she began, voice barely above the hum of the overhead fan. I think I spent so many years trying to earn my place in people's lives that I forgot what it felt like to already have one." She looked down the table. Tonight, this is more than I ever thought I'd receive. Thank you, all of you, for reminding me that quiet doesn't mean invisible, and that peace, real peace, is what happens when we finally stop apologizing for taking up space." Another ripple of applause followed, gentler this time, reverent. As dessert was served, warm peach cobbler with sweet cream, Pat leaned back in her chair and looked around the garden. Laughter floated across the table. Candle flames danced against glassware. She felt full, not just from the food or the praise, but from the relief of no longer carrying what she never should have held. Melissa wasn't there. She hadn't called again, hadn't knocked, hadn't sent another hollow message, and somehow that absence made the night feel more whole. Later, as the evening wound down and guests began slipping away with hugs and whispered goodbyes, Joanne caught Pat by the elbow. "Still think you don't deserve a thank you?" she said, smiling. Pat shook her head slowly. "Tonight. I believed it." Joanne handed her a small envelope, no name on the front, only a pressed wax seal in the shape of an open book. "What's this?" "Just a note," Joanne said, "from someone who found the courage to apply to that scholarship because of you." Pat held the envelope gently, as if it might dissolve. She didn't open it, not yet. Some things deserved to be savored. Pat opened the safe with a quiet click. Her fingers turned the dial out of habit, not needing to glance at the numbers. She could have done it blindfolded by now. Inside, the contents were few but deliberate. The birth certificate, the deed, the letters she had written with care, and now, finally, the certified, sealed estate documents. She slid them in with the same steadiness she'd once used to shelve borrowed books in the school library, not reverent exactly, but purposeful. Her hand hovered for a moment over the folder's spine. Then she closed the lid and spun the dial back into place. No hesitation, no second checking. It was done. Outside, morning sunlight filtered softly through the trees, dappling the porch steps in warm gold. Charleston had that rare kind of early light that made everything, porch rails, concrete, flower beds, look forgiving. Pat stepped out in a linen blouse and wide-brimmed hat, locking the door behind her with one hand and carrying her purse in the other. Sandra waited at the end of the walkway with a takeaway coffee in each hand. "Should I be flattered that you trust me to drive you somewhere other than a courthouse?" she teased, passing her the paper cup. "I trust you with a lot more than that," Pat replied. They drove in quiet companionship, windows down, letting the soft harbor breeze sneak through. Downtown was just beginning to stir. The sidewalks held couples with cameras, old men reading newspapers at wrought iron cafe tables, joggers weaving between street corners. The city had its own tempo, and today, Pat felt in rhythm with it for the first time in years. The cafe was small and tucked between a florist and a second-hand bookstore, both of which smelled faintly of nostalgia. They chose a table on the back patio, where the view opened to the harbor, glittering under a sky that couldn't decide if it was still morning or already noon. Sandra pulled off her sunglasses and sighed into her seat. This was a good idea. "I told you," Pat said, taking a sip. "Charleston's always better when it's quiet." They sat in companionable silence, watching the water shift gently. A fishing boat cut through the bay. A pair of seagulls circled above, dipping toward the boardwalk and retreating just as fast. Across the patio, two older women glanced their way and offered small waves. Pat nodded back. No need to smile too wide, just enough to be known. Sandra leaned on her elbow. "You notice people are treating you differently?" "Not differently," Pat said. "Just clearly." A waiter came by and dropped a check without asking, smiling like they were regulars. Pat traced the rim of her cup with her finger and looked out across the horizon. She wasn't thinking of Melissa, not anymore. Instead, she was thinking of the fund, of what it would become, of the emails she'd already received, applications submitted, handwritten notes from first-year teachers in borrowed shoes and thrifted blazers. Some from towns she'd never visited, some from schools that looked just like hers. She thought of bulletin boards made with care, desks arranged with hope, of sticky fingers raised high in classrooms that might finally feel safe. She thought of kids being called on, even when their answers were uncertain. Sandra reached into her bag and slid a small paper envelope across the table. "What's this?" Pat asked. "A thank you," Sandra said. "From Meredith's sister-in-law. She's applying for the fund. I figured you'd want to read it before it gets filed away." Pat took the envelope but didn't open it. She smiled softly, letting it sit beside her coffee. Not everything needed to be read immediately. Some things could sit a while and still be meaningful. A light breeze stirred the corner of the napkin under her saucer. From the sidewalk out front, someone called out, "Hey, Ms. Harlow," and Pat turned to see a former student waving from the street. Grown now, a child of her own in tow. Pat waved back and the woman smiled and kept walking. "I'll never get used to that," Sandra said. "You're like a living legend in these parts." "I'm just someone who stayed long enough to be remembered," Pat said. The wind kicked up again, gentle and wide. Pat leaned back in her chair and looked out over the harbor, her gaze calm and unhurried. She felt light, not empty, just unburdened, like her body had finally made room for a future she no longer feared. There was no part of her waiting for a knock on the door, or a message, or another shoe to drop. No more performing grace, no more apologizing for how quietly she refused to be erased. She looked over at Sandra, then back to the view, and finally spoke, her voice quiet but steady. "A seat at the table isn't given, it's claimed."